Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Hollander, Artistic Director and founder of Battery Dance. And here we are on Battery Dance TV, our Sunday regular program, Dance Diplomacy with Jonathan. Diplomacy might be a little bit of a misnomer for this interview because Amy Chin, whom I'm interviewing and who's a friend and a colleague for too many years to remember, is located close by. However, both of us have artistic interests that span the globe. So, Amy, I'm so happy to have you here with us. Look at that beautiful background.
Oh, it's such a pleasure always, Jonathan, to have conversation with you, or programs with you.
Well, I think we first met when you were working at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. Is that correct?
That could be many moons ago. I was the arts program specialist at the Department of Cultural Affairs, and I think that is probably when we first met.
How did you find your way to the Department of Cultural Affairs? What came before that that led you into that role?
Well, you know, all my life I've been interested in the arts, whether it's visual arts or if it's performing arts. And I found my way to the Department of Cultural Affairs, oddly enough, through a job ad in the New York Times. So,
Oh, okay.
But as a teenager, I studied Chinese traditional dance and other forms of dance. And I continued that into adulthood and performing with the company that you knew that I worked for. And in addition to performing, I just realized that I was also a good arts administrator. And I became an arts administrator doing fundraising, doing management. And there came a point in my life a few years after graduating from school that I realized that this could be a career. And so I answered an ad in the New York Times and somehow landed at the Department of Cultural Affairs, reviewing grant applications and administering grant contracts to hundreds of not-for-profit cultural organizations in New York City.
Well, actually, I don't know whether you realize this, but we have somewhat of a parallel path in the sense that the one full-time job that I ever had other than working for Battery Dance and leaving aside my very short stint at a cheese shop in the village was with the Center for Arts Information, which was at that time originally a wing of the New York State Council on the Arts, which, as you probably know, was the first state arts council in the country. And as such, they received every publication, books, periodicals, papers written, and they created a library, and that became the Center for Arts Information, which was eventually subsumed into the New York Foundation for the Arts. But so I did have my stint in arts management service organizations. So yeah, I think we meet on many levels, Amy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, you know, fast forward when you were working for the Young People's Chinese Cultural Center, which was located just down the block from Battery Dance, we had a lot of interaction, and we were so happy to present the dance company that was affiliated with the Young People's Chinese Cultural Center. And many dancers were coming from China and bringing their intensive, fabulous training in the Peking opera style of dance. So how did that emerge?
It's kind of interesting, you know, the trajectory of the Young People's Chinese Cultural Center, which later changed its name to the New York Chinese Cultural Center, and the dance company that was affiliated with it, which was the Chinese Folk Dance Company. So it actually started out in the 70s, that company, and it started out as a community program teaching dance and other arts to children. And I think, like many dance companies of that period, you know, you start with a school, and then the company grows out of the school. So when the company first started in the 70s, actually there was not diplomatic relations between the United States and mainland China. So it was kind of an interesting period for the founders of the company. I'm not an original founder. I came to it a couple of years after it was founded. But for the original founders, they would travel to China and they would learn these dances, and they would come back and they would teach it to students here. And but then after the normalization of relations with mainland China, the center started getting an influx of professional dancers that were coming here from mainland to study dance ostensibly, and then some of them stayed. And so we were very fortunate at that time then to have professional dancers coming from academies and schools in mainland China to teach us here in the United States. And then the company grew because now we had this enormous talent immigrating to this country. So, and then in later years, as the school grew, and we were able to train some of the students, and they became professional dancers too as part of the company. So it was a bit of a mix. And what was interesting at that period of time too, I would say, you know, throughout the 80s and into the 90s, because China was opening up to the rest of the world, they were really interested in things like contemporary dance and things like hip hop or, you know, other forms of dance, which they had not had the opportunity to learn or to see in the 70s and in the 60s. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the Chinese Americans and the general public here in America was really interested in traditional Chinese dances, the folk dances and the classical dances. And I was just thinking about this the other day. We had some professional dancers that came from mainland China that came here and said, why do you want to learn those old-fashioned dances? Nobody even performs them anymore in China. And in some instances, we were teaching these professional dancers from mainland China traditional Chinese dance that they did
Oh
not
my
learn.
goodness. Talk about cross-cultural. But we were so, you know, the Battery Dance Festival, which was previously called the Downtown Dance Festival, we gained so much beauty and vibrancy from these traditional Chinese dances that were done impeccably. I mean, this didn't look like a student initiative at all. I mean, the ribbon dances and the acrobatic, you know, dancers in animal costumes leaping over each other and doing these remarkable gymnastic stunts. It was really fantastic, just beautiful. But I did see a transition. I do remember I think that one of the last performances of the group, or a form of the group, took place at Governor's Island. And they were doing more, I would say, more balletically infused performances at that time.
Yeah, I mean, the folk dances are the folk dances and the classical dances, but I think over time, of course, you have different kinds of influences and new techniques that come into play. When I left the company, one of the things that we were working on is actually creating new choreographies based on traditional techniques. So a lot of people think of folk and traditional dances as being very static or set in time, but you know, there are subtle changes, and I think that those movement styles and the tradition influence also contemporary dance. So there was some new hybrid dances that were coming into play, and we were encouraging that, you know, new choreographies using traditional techniques.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know what I'm thinking about? I'm remembering the bird flu, and I think you were with the company at that time.
Yeah.
And here we are in the pandemic, but that was an earlier experience where there was an element of prejudice against Chinese dancers. And I seem to remember, am I talking, is this something that you were involved with? I feel it was, that you had a lot of performances scheduled in New Jersey schools and community centers and theaters, and all of a sudden many of them were canceled. Is that correct? Is my memory serving me?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I mean, what was the old saying? You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And you know, after many years in dance, I've pivoted a little bit, and I do a lot of genealogy and historical studies now. And what was interesting, for that you bring that up is that, yes, during the SARS epidemic, our company was booked for many shows. I think at that period of time, we were doing almost 1,000 performances and lecture demonstrations every year. It was a
I
very packed
remember it was
schedule.
an extraordinary number. I was trying to do the math of how could they be doing that many performances, and there are only 365 days in the year. But I learned about that number because a huge number were canceled.
Yeah, I mean, back then we could even do up to 5 or 6 shows a day. You know how we do these education programs in the schools. You could do 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and then you might have a family or a theater program at night. So we were very busy. And then when the SARS epidemic happened, all of a sudden, even though we are an American company, and our performers and administrators had not traveled to China in the previous year, we found that people were canceling our performances because they associated the avian bird flu with someone being Chinese. It was
I
horrific.
remember that. It was really, really tragic. And unfortunately, as you said, it's come around again. I think that a lot of people were keeping their distance from Chinatown and Chinatown restaurants during this very difficult time when these small businesses are struggling to survive in New York.
Yeah, and then, when I was referencing history, I mean, that SARS incident happened 15, 20 years ago. But even earlier in time, I mean, there was a smallpox epidemic in San Francisco, Chinatown in the 1800s. And even though the disease did not originate in an Asian community in San Francisco, they quarantined Chinatown. And so this is way back in history, and it seems that it's a certain kind of cultural bias that has been a part of American history for a very long time. I was actually talking to someone recently about how it's interesting that Chinese restaurants have been a part of the American landscape probably for almost 200 years. Yet we don't think of Chinese restaurants, which are so ubiquitous, as being American, but we think of pizzerias, which are probably here a shorter amount of time, and we think of them as being Americans. So, it kind of raises that question. Why is that? Why is the Asian culture seen as a perennial foreigner?
I think this is a great segue to what you're doing right now this week in New York. And Sunday is the last day of a huge initiative of Think Chinatown. Tell us about that, because I think these cultural events are ways to, be an antidote, a counter to these terrible, ignorant kind of racism.
Yeah, well, Think Chinatown is a young organization, and it was formed just 3 years ago. And the idea is, how do we break down the barriers? How do we demystify Chinatown? How do we create the Chinatown that, how do we define our own community, and how do we demystify it to others? And it's an organization that is multi-generational. There are many young people in the organization who did not grow up in Chinatowns, but have gravitated toward Chinatowns as a cultural heart, cultural center for their beings. And then there are people in the organization who have been in Chinatown for many generations, and some people are immigrants recently, and some have been in America, probably longer than you have or I have. Our families anyway. And it's an organization that is trying to bridge those differences. So one of our annual programs that we started 3 years ago is Chinatown Arts Week. And Chinatown Arts Week, it happens across Chinatown this year because of the pandemic. A lot of our programs are also virtual, which has been great. We've been able to open up our programs nationally and internationally. And some of the programs that we have on the Chinatown Arts Week schedule actually are in Chinatowns across the United States. We had a panel the other night that was a film screening and a director's talk for a film called Dragon Masters, which, if you haven't seen it, is really a great documentary. It talks about dragon dance. While the film launches with a dragon dance troupe that was taught by a martial arts master in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, starting in the 1970s and continues to today, it delves into this history of Chinese dragon dances in America and in China. And one of the surprising facts was that one of the first dragon dances to come to the United States came in, I think, the 1860s, and traveled all across America. So again, just like Chinese restaurants that have been here for a long time, yet we still think of them as being foreign. So, and on that Dragon Masters directors panel, we had someone on the talk coming to us from Yunnan, China. Another panelist was from Canada. Then we had a host from New Jersey. I was here in New York. And then we had an expert on dragon dances beaming to us from the Bay Area in San Francisco. So it's been pretty wonderful. But the basis
well, Amy,
of,
let me just
yes.
jump in here. If our audience wants to see any of these things, do they live live now on YouTube, or is the opportunity over?
No, we've recorded most of the programs. And so if people want to jump in, please go to our website at thinkchinatown.org. And you can see past programs as well as more recent ones. So,
that's great. Because I know I've been so busy this week, I've missed a lot of the great programs you had that were just next door to me. I plan to go out after our interview and check out some of these wonderful street sites and windows that have been set up. But so I know that our audience is, we have an audience that expands across 200 countries. So I'm excited that Sunday is just full of Chinatown and Chinese culture in New York, and as you said, across the United States and different countries. So me to Ling Tang, who is going to be teaching a traditional Chinese dance and also a solo that she's going to record for us. But what's next on the agenda for Think Chinatown?
For Chinatown Arts Week or in general?
In general.
Well, Think Chinatown works in a lot of spaces, not physical spaces, but we're doing some civic engagement programs. We also have recently been working to assist businesses in Chinatown. One of our big projects this past summer was something called Assembly for Chinatown. And we worked with a team of volunteer architects and builders, and we worked with Chinatown restaurants to create dining structures for their businesses and decorate it with the artwork of local artists. So that's one thing we've been working on.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're also working on educating the community on how to get involved civically. There was a horrific fire in Chinatown at the old schoolhouse at 70 Mulberry Street. And we've been staying on top of that, informing the community on how they can have input on how, when, and what gets rebuilt in that space, and to preserve it as a community space for Chinatown.
Yeah, it was a tragedy for H.T. Chen and Diane Dong, who've been working for, I think, as long as Battery Dance. And their facility was in that building. And I know that they're looking forward to a future when they can restart all of their wonderful activities of classes and performances.
Yeah. We've also been collecting stories and trying to find different ways of getting Chinatown stories out there. We've worked with artists to illustrate interviews that we've done with local people. We've partnered with places like the Urban Archive and StoryCorps. And actually a program that we have that you can see online is that we've taken some of these interviews and turned them into animations. And it gives a much deeper and more personal insight into people and the community.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, and then we're also working with businesses in Chinatown. I mean, we're trying to really break down barriers across many different boundaries. One project that Think Chinatown does is called Everyday Chinatown, and we've taken sort of ordinary objects like a Chinese medicine pot or maybe a tea kettle. And then we've interviewed seniors and had them explain what these objects are and what their significance is. And they do it multilingually in Cantonese, Mandarin, Shanghainese, and in English. And in the past, we've taken these objects and we've put them in beautiful display in local shop windows with a phone-in service so people can dial in and you press 1 for English, 2 for Chinese, 3 for Cantonese. And you can hear these seniors and local people explain what these objects are. And
Oh, this sounds absolutely fantastic. You're illuminating me to all the things I've been missing, but I am determined in the next couple of weeks to catch up with Think Chinatown and the Arts Week and everything that you've been doing. It's fantastic. One last question. How about dance? How about, I know at one point there were 2 or 3 or 4 Chinese dance companies doing traditional work, folk dance and contemporary. How do you see the landscape of dance in the community at this point? I know that we've all been suffering the performing arts. It's just incredible how much has been lost since March.
yeah, I mean, it's hard because dance is so time-based and it's you have to be there. Our bodies are our instruments, and we have to stay 6 feet apart now. In terms of Chinese dance, what's kind of interesting is when my company first got started, there were only a handful across the country, but now there are so many more Chinese dance companies across the country. And not only that, I think when we first started out, dancing was thought to be a little bit weird, or in the Chinese community, or somewhat suspect, as dance sometimes is considered in many cultures. But now it's become really popular, and you have amateur dance groups as well as professional ones, and you have this whole generation also of seniors who were denied the chance to learn and do dance in their youth. And so now you see them, and there are a lot of these recreational companies in senior centers, and they're hiring professional dancers to teach them. And you see them sometimes in the parades in Chinatown, and it's so cute because they have on these elaborate costumes, and they're doing dance moves that they've learned recently. And practically most of the senior centers in New York that have a significant Chinese population, they have a dance program. So I think there's real hope. There are a lot of dance schools now too. So it's growing.
Well, Battery Dance received a CASA grant, or SUCASA grant, from the Department of Cultural Affairs and the City Council. And we worked with a Chinatown senior citizen group. And many of my dancers came in for different components during the year, and they all came back flushed with excitement. They said these seniors have so much spirit, and they're so creative, and there's nothing that we give them that they don't want to do. In other words, they are so active. And there was a final showing, and I went there, and I mean, it was palpable, the excitement and the good feeling that we had. And I have to say that for Battery Dance, having been based on the border between Chinatown and Tribeca and Civic Center and Soho, that it was the first time that there was a real integration, I felt, between our activity and Chinatown in terms of our dance. I mean, of course, the performances of the Roar Dance Company in our festival, but this took a whole year. And it was a really integrated program. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for the future when we can get rid of this social distancing prohibitions, when the pandemic is over, and where, we're learning things during the pandemic about what we can do that, circumvents the physical space and goes virtual. So let's hope for a better future. Let's hope for a more integrated future. And I am just so in awe and respectful of everything that you've done personally, Amy, and that all of your colleagues have done. So congratulations. And thank you so much for coming on with during this week when you are probably at your busiest. I really appreciate it.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Thank you, Jonathan, for always being supportive and for everything that you do.
You're very welcome.